Hey, the Energy Nerd Show is like a giant regional power grid. It's like run like super efficiently for lowest cost and best optimized outcome.
For ratepayers.
Luckily, we have no ratepayers for Energy Nerd Show and Tell, so it works out.
Who's our guest today, Jeannie?
Our guest is Devi Glick. She is a senior associate at Synapse.
Cool. Hi, Debbie.
Hey, Devi.
Good morning.
Morning.
So you have an interesting graph. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, so this graph is from a paper published by Sierra Club called Playing with Other People's Money about how non-economic coal operations distorts energy markets. And I know that might sound really wonky and nerdy and people might fall asleep, but don't, I promise. It's actually really exciting, really exciting. So this graph essentially shows a comparison between how coal plants are operated and dispatched based on their ownership. And this is relevant because merchant coal plants are coal plants that are owned by just regular companies that have a motivation to earn profit and not lose money for their shareholders. The ones in blue, the regulated coal plants, are owned by companies such as Duke Energy that have ratepayers that are basically captive. And so this graph essentially shows that the different ownership model incentivizes behavior differently. And essentially the merchant coal plants are acting more conservatively and have better results and are losing less money because they are responsible essentially for their entire revenue themselves. Whereas the regulated coal plants, which can recover revenue from ratepayers very easily if they lose money, are acting much less optimally and are overrunning their units and are basically making ratepayers pay the cost of that.
You say Duke and regulated utilities are running their coal plants more than would be economic. So what's the outcome of that?
So that has a bunch of different outcomes. So first, in terms of revenue, so ratepayers, people that live in places that are served by these utilities, their electricity bill covers the cost to run these units. And so if, Duke, for example, is running this coal plant when it's not economic, they're not making that much money from the market. They're not covering the cost to turn that plant on and operate it. But they can just get the ratepayers to pay it. So the ratepayers in their bills are paying for that. And it's emitting way more emissions than it needs to. So instead of getting electricity from wind or other renewable energy or even just lower emission resources, these plants are being run and essentially cutting the line. They're literally like cutting ahead in the line and displacing these other resources that are lower emission and lower cost.
Shouldn't the regulators care about that and be on top of this problem and fixing it?
Yeah, but coal plants are really hard to operate, Bruce, and it's a really complicated issue. Yes, they should be. And that's a lot of what I do every day in my job is try to teach the regulators about that.
So the four acronyms at the bottom represent four different regions of the country. And so is it that the regulators in those regions are addressing things differently?
So there's a combination of things going on. So yeah, MISO is the market that operates in the middle of the country. SPP is down in the south. ERCOT is Texas, and PJM is the mid-Atlantic. And what happens there is a market where these plants that are owned by the utilities, they basically bid into it. And so there's a combination of the regulators overseeing the individual utilities and the market also dispatching. So what's happening here is the utilities are essentially using the market to their advantage and gaming the market in a way that regulators don't always have full transparency into because the utilities are not sharing their data, or the regulators just simply don't know that this is happening because it's happening in ways that are pretty technical and complicated. And not all regulators, all commissions are technical. Many of them are elected. And it's more of a political position. It's not actually a technical position.
So you've been testifying in various places, pointing out this problem that it's occurring and that it's got some negative impacts for the public interest. Are regulators open to that? Are they listening, and do they get it?
We'll see. They're starting to listen, I should say. So it's unclear whether they are starting to get it, but very recently they have started to essentially open these what are called dockets. Essentially, it's an administrative venue to listen to the Sierra Club and other interveners talk about and present the information on what's going on. This is a pretty new set of issues that it's being dug into at the regulatory level. So it's still unclear whether the regulators are really going to be reining in the behavior of many of these coal plants.
It looks like PJM is doing a little bit better than some of the other regions. Is that what you see?
So PJM does look like it's doing a little bit better in the mid-Atlantic. I pulled some data this morning actually looking at basically how many coal plants this actually represents, how much emissions these coal plants have. So PJM is not quite as bad as MISO, for example, and SPP. But these coal plants altogether from MISO, SPP, and PJM, they make up the majority of coal plant emissions in the US. They own the majority of coal plants. So New England, New York, don't own very many coal plants. Even though, PJM is doing a little bit better, I would say MISO is the absolute worst offender of all of these regions.
And in Texas, we see a really big gap between the merchant coal units and the regulated ones. But in Texas, the coal is really dirty, right? A lot of lignite. And have you looked at emissions, how these different utilities are handling that?
So I haven't looked at emissions across the utilities, and I especially haven't looked in ERCOT. So ERCOT is its own separate market from the West and from the East. So it's a little bit of a different animal. That's a good question about the emissions impact. So if you want to think about what the emissions impact of this behavior is across the US, you can kind of take a step back and think about what are the emissions from all coal plants. And the coal plants just in these regions, they basically account for about, according to my quick calculations this morning in 2018 data, about 35% of CO2 emissions in the US. So if you say that maybe, half of them are owned by, or fall into this kind of the blue category of the regulated coal plants as opposed to the merchant generators, so just picking a number, then that's, about 20%. And if just 10% of them are dispatching uneconomically of those hours, maybe that's only 2% of US emissions. It doesn't seem like a huge amount. It's big, but it's not huge. But the important thing to realize is that many of these coal plants are operating in this manner because if they don't, then they're going to be shut down. And so the amount of emissions that's actually implicated in this behavior is not equal to the amount of time that this behavior is happening. It's larger because many of them are operating because they need to prove that they're useful. And if they didn't operate, they would shut down. And so it's actually a significant portion of the total emissions from coal plants that I would say is actually resulted from this behavior.
So if you're digging a hole, you don't want to stop, just keep digging.
Keep digging. You might get to China.
I mean, it does seem like in a world where people are talking about, is it worth spending $10 a ton of CO2 to reduce emissions or $100 a ton? And, we've got all these rather expensive CO2 reducing technologies and policies that we're looking at, and what's worth it and kind of weighing the cost of it. It seems like here's a mine of CO2 reductions that are available not just for free, but would be saving money to realize these reductions. It's pretty outrageous.
It's basically low-hanging fruit. It's free fruit. That's really good quality and low-hanging. That's just being left on the tree. I do kind of believe that it's been getting worse lately. Like, I don't think it's always been quite this bad and egregious. I mean, if you look at like LNP prices and gas prices, but the fact that it's been this bad for, a couple years now at least, and is only going to get worse. It's like, okay, you've seen the writing on the wall. It's time to change.
Are the market rules changing to make this happen? Or it's just like, there's just so many factors?
It's just like coal plants are traditionally operated just as baseload. Like they were always needed. They were always on. And there wasn't a need to think about, doesn't make sense to keep it on. It just, they were built to operate all the time. And so switching to the construct where you actually look at whether they're actually economic, because the reality is they're not actually competitive all the time anymore. It's not how the utilities traditionally think. And many of these people that work at utilities and the operations divisions have been there for decades, right? So it's not just like thinking about there's an issue with, so there's an issue with the market, but B, the people that have been doing this are the same people that were doing it when the plant was built. And so it's like a physics problem to get the inertia to go over the hump, to think about things differently.
Yeah, they're like our age.
Oh, geez. So yeah, the utility inertia is responsible for a lot of big problems.
Back in the day when gas was not inexpensive as it is today, and renewables didn't seem to be available in large quantities and so on, it wasn't crazy to think after you build a coal plant that you'd run it flat out as much as you could. That has changed. So we old timers are going to have to get out of the way. This is all really interesting about these particular coal plants running uneconomically in various regions. But has anyone tried to estimate how big an impact this is, say on a national scale?
Sierra Club, in the report that this graphic comes from, estimated that the impact on ratepayers is about $3.8 billion between 2015 and 2018. And once again, that's on the ratepayers that are served by the companies that own these plants, because essentially the utilities are operating them and earning less money to dispatch them than they're actually making from the market. And so then the ratepayers are paying the rest. And so that amounts to, billions of dollars.
So are people really mad about that? Like, aren't people furious?
This will have to be part 2 of an Energy Nerd Show. Most of that data is not public. Most of that is very confidential, and very little of the information that relates to that is actually able to be published. So it all happens kind of behind closed doors in utility proceedings.
What a colossal waste.
Yeah. Yes.
Thanks for telling us about it.
You're welcome.
Debbie, it's really good to see you.
Great to see you guys.
Thanks for being on the show.
You're welcome.
Take care.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks for watching. This is Energy Nerd Show and Tell.
It's the show that we want to watch, so we're thinking maybe some of you energy nerds want to watch it too. If you do, then tell your friends and subscribe right around here. Click there.
And check
or there or over here.
Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and where else?
And the Energy Nerd website at energynerdshow.com. You can always go there. And if you want to be a guest, you can volunteer to be a guest. We love to have guests. In fact, that's kind of what the show is all about.
Absolutely.